Hi, everyone. I'm Stephen Robinson. Welcome to the Play Typer Guy podcast. It is September 25th, 2024, as of recording, and joining me is my friend Noah Berlatsky. Noah is a fellow contributor at Public Notice and also the author of the great newsletter Everything is Horrible, which is not. It is actually quite insightful. I enjoy reading it every day. And I wanted to start off because Noah had actually written for Public Notice about the Mark Robinson scandal, the story that CNN broke. Hard to call it a scandal because we've sort of known that Robinson is really a terrible human being. You know, the horrible anti-Semitic, bigoted remarks he had made on a porn site's message board. Then, of course, CNN broke this story, but then it felt as if CNN, during the same weekend, kind of muted the impact with a sort of look over here, both sides narrative that it created. Sort of targeting U.S. Representative Rashida Tlaib. Um, can you discuss? You'd been discussing some of this on social media, and I found your take on this particularly interesting. So, can you kind of take us through what had occurred and CNN's part in this?
Sure. Rashida Tlaib criticized the Democratic Michigan Attorney General Dana Nessel. First, she said setting a dangerous precedent because Nessel had prosecuted University of Michigan students who were peacefully protesting against the Gaza war. And Nessel suggested, I think, that this criticism was anti-Semitic because Nessel is Jewish. And then CNN sort of, basically they said that this is Jake Tapper and Dana Bash. They both said that Tlaib had specifically said that Nessel was prejudiced because she was Jewish, but Tlaib never said that. In fact, she said that it was that the office had a bias, that there was an anti-Palestinian bias, but she didn't say anything about it being because Nessel was Jewish. She didn't mention Nessel's Judaism at all. I think there was a mention that Nessel was Jewish in the article. There was an article by a Detroit newspaper.
Mm-hmm.
And the reporter who worked on that article said, Tlaib didn't say that. And, they kind of walked it back. Jake Tapper said he misspoke. But, nobody ever apologized to Tlaib for they didn't apologize to her. They kind of sort of made it, well, she implied that, though she didn't imply anything of the kind. And, to me, it's just this kind of example of how anti-Semitism is, these accusations of anti-Semitism are kind of weaponized against people who, either criticize Israel's actions or criticize the attack on protesters. Any sort of criticism of Israel is sort of framed as anti-Semitic, to the extent where, they're making things up to smear her. And it's even worse. It's even worse because they, there was just this really ugly racist cartoon targeting Tlaib in, I can't remember, in a Detroit paper. And, there was very little pushback,
Mm-hmm.
either in the mainstream media, among Democrats. The head of the ADL, Jonathan Greenblatt, joined in and claimed that Tlaib had said this anti-Semitic thing, which he absolutely did not say. So, and the ADL is supposed to be traditionally has, sort of like not only been about fighting anti-Semitism, but has been trying to, fight white supremacy and other kinds of bigotry. So to have them sort of to have him jump in with what's basically a racist smear, I mean, like
Oh yeah.
they smeared Rashida Tlaib as being anti-Semitic, even though she
Mhm.
isn't, and obviously they feel they can do that because
And
she's Palestinian.
oh, exactly. The only Palestinian member of the House. She's also censored by her even including her colleagues for comments she had made opposing Israel's actions in the war. In the larger context, what I found interesting, what you'd mentioned, the horrible cartoon and suggesting, not only sort of making light of, what many would consider war crimes against people in Lebanon. It was targeting her smearing her as a terrorist and targeting her as uh, sort of wishing violence upon her. But even in that context, when Nessel, as a Democrat and from her own state in Michigan, basically said, "Oh, it's wrong to do that because she's, Palestinian or Muslim." But it's also wrong that she said, essentially essentially trying to do a both sides, punching her with the smear while sort of looking big about defending her from an actual horribly racist cartoon. And again, when CNN, to put that in the context of CNN breaks the Mark Robinson story. Robinson, someone who had referred to himself as a black Nazi, someone who had talked about, and even before he'd won the nomination for governor, and he's a sitting lieutenant governor, had referred to Black Panther being some sort of Jewish plot to separate Black people from their shekels. Horrible stuff. And when the Republican presidential and vice presidential nominees, uh, Trump, Donald Trump, and J.D. Vance, have not denounced him. The no Republicans haven't actually denounced him, and Tom Cotton. They were all dancing around the issues and what was said, and kind of like, oh, things are concerning. And their spin was always to be like, oh, well, forget what the actual potential someone we want to be governor of a state, forget that. What about what these college students said? Uh, which itself is absurd. But then to have CNN kind of almost embrace that narrative, and then because in the segment Dana Bash hosted, she was sort of like, over the weekend, neither Republicans or Democrats are able to denounce anti-Semitic comments from their members. That's the both sides problem, which does not exist. And when they tried to, the example they gave was, I guess, trying to, confront Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan, about the comments, which were not comments. Like, so they essentially keyed up with misinformation. It was like a Fox News ambush because she simply didn't say this. And, I consider myself a relatively well-informed person. Shame on me if I didn't know this. I had no idea Dana Nessel was Jewish. I mean, I'm sure that is part of her backstory, her identity. It's not something she hides. I'm not suggesting that. Just that as someone just as aware of her work on level, it just didn't register with me. I knew about her queerness because that had been, sort of a big applause moment at the Democratic National Convention. That was great. But, so it just seemed out of nowhere. And it seemed very clear that the Congresswoman was saying, hey, I think there's a bias towards Palestinians, and to leap from that to saying it's because she's Jewish, and we've discussed this, seems absurd. Where essentially, anti-Palestinian bias is a pretty sort of equal opportunity issue or problem in America.
One big example of anti-Palestinian bias is this thing we're talking about, right? I mean, Tapper and Messel and bash all felt completely empowered to just like lie about what she'd said. And, they don't feel they have to apologize to her. They obviously feel she's, if she didn't actually say it, she's still guilty, right? Which is how racism tends to work. The idea that you can lie about somebody because they're bad anyway, just by nature of being who they are.
You've addressed this idea that it's actually very dangerous to Jewish people to create this situation of where criticizing Israel, criticizing its right-wing government is in fact criticizing Jewish people. It's essentially an attack on your identity itself.
There's people who do, identify very strongly with Israel and who feel like an attack on, any criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic, or lots of criticisms of Israel that I wouldn't consider anti-Semitic or anti-Semitic. But yeah, I mean, for me, and I think for a lot of people who are Jews on the left, creating this situation where it's like fine to like lie, to just like, I mean, in this case, to just like openly lie and like create an anti-Semitism when there isn't any. That this is. I'm sorry, the dog is. Anyway, that there's this creating this situation where it's kind of like just the default that we assume left-wing people are anti-Semitic. We assume that anybody who's pro-Palestinian is anti-Semitic, and that's kind of like the most important, version of anti-Semitism. That's like what we really, really need to police, more than like Marjorie Taylor Greene talking about space lasers, more than Donald Trump getting up in front of a Jewish audience and talking about anti-Semitism and saying basically, if I lose the election, it's your fault. I.e., if I lose the election, my Nazi fans should go after Jews.
Yeah.
Like Jonathan Greenblatt sort of like had a wishy-washy statement on that. Like, we thank Donald Trump for all he's done, but maybe he shouldn't have said that one thing. I mean, that's not helpful. And
that's like that's like speaking to him like a mob boss. Like you're just sort of like, oh, Don. That's been so
right.
kind to us.
And what happens is that one form of like kind of like validated anti-Semitism is coming after left Jews and deplatforming left Jews and claiming that they are the epitome of anti-Semitism. That, and you see this all, like Germany has been like just like deplatforming a lot of Jewish people. You see, when Jewish people try to speak on college campuses or protest, they get arrested, they get, people say, oh, you can't have them speak. So, I mean, the main target of these kind of smear campaigns, are people like Tlaib. I mean, they're Palestinians, and Palestinians who are speaking out against the occupation, Palestinians who are speaking out against the genocide. I mean, they get, obviously they're the ones who are mainly targeted, and you see that with Tlaib, who is just like relentlessly demonized and attacked. Mm-hmm. But a major secondary target is progressive Jewish people. There's this idea that that progressive Jewish people don't really count as Jews, that they're the main ones spreading anti-Semitism, and it's super dangerous because historically the Nazis, Hitler, like conflated progressives and Jews. Like, he sort of like his main target was left Jews, which he considered all Jews to be leftists, right? And this idea that, that it's fine if the right wing targets left Jews is really dangerous, because that's kind of like the main people they want to go after anyway. When you're talking about what has actually resulted in anti-Semitic violence against Jewish people in the US, I mean, the biggest anti-Semitic massacre in U.S. history was in 2018 at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. And, that was the guy who did that was inspired by these anti-George Soros conspiracy theories about Soros sort of like funding migrant caravans, right? And Donald Trump pushed those conspiracy theories, right? I mean, he was on Fox News, saying, they asked him, "Is George Soros doing that?" And he said, "Well, I've heard maybe," right? So, and I feel, and Tree of Life was targeted because they were like pro-immigrant, right? I mean, they had programs to sort of try to help asylum seekers and immigrants in the U.S. And you don't really hear about that. I mean, there's not really like much recognition that this massacre happened because of right-wing smears against progressive Jews. And that's kind of, it's like, that's all forgotten. And instead it's all about, oh, well, the real problem is Jewish Voices for Peace saying that, they don't support Israel bombing children. And I think it's so, I think it's just, it's obviously like, it's a moral disaster, I think, for the Democratic Party and for some Jewish institutions in terms of supporting what Israel is doing now. But it's also like, I mean, it's just super dangerous in terms of anti-Semitism in the US to be presenting things as if there's any question about like which side is more dangerous, right? Mm-hmm. And also to sort of like, because like support for Israel has become this way for people who are openly anti-Semitic to say, well, you can't accuse me of being anti-Semitic. And that includes like, I mean, it includes Tucker Carlson, includes like Steve Bannon, right? I mean, there are a lot of these people who are pro-Zionist because, for various reasons, because they like the ethno-nationalism, because they're involved in evangelical communities who have sort of millenarian ideas about Israel, or who also are just super Islamophobic, right? And who like Israel for that reason. But, I mean, like, so, I support Israel has become this kind of get out of jail free, get out of anti-Semitism free card. And on the other hand, people who criticize Israel and who haven't said anything anti-Semitic, they make up, people, including the news media, will just like make up, quotes and just lie about it. And I think that it's, I mean, it's a sign of, it's bigotry. It's also, because it's a sign of, our complicity in this really sort of like these horrific war crimes. And, as far as the Democratic Party goes, I mean, it's partially, if Democratic leadership were more willing to stand against, to sort of like tell Israel, if Biden's policy were more aggressive in trying to push Israel to stop this rather than giving them weapons, there'd be much less incentive for Democrats to make excuses and to demonize protesters in this way. So I think there's sort of like various levels of it, but I do think it's, besides being sort of like a moral abomination for a whole list of reasons, like it's really dangerous for Jewish people in the US and for progressive Jews in particular, but really for everybody. I mean, it's just not, it doesn't matter, what your politics are. If you're Jewish, like, sort of like excusing Donald Trump's anti-Semitism, I mean, he could be president. I mean, it's not good. And when he was president, again, he like, inspired the worst anti-Semitic massacre in U.S. history. So I'd prefer not to have that happen again.
Yeah, and I think it seems part of the challenge uh, is that it very clearly was made that it was hard for um, Tlaib to advocate for her own, as a Palestinian, to advocate for Gaza in a way that was not going to be interpreted as anti-Semitic. And I'm big on communication as a politician. Your job is message. So, are there things you could have said differently or better? Certainly, I believe there certainly was things you could have perhaps massaged, but it just, you know, I had interviewed on this podcast the Georgia State Rep Rural Roman, who had been prepared to make a speech at the DNC, did
Yes,
not
yes, I
have the
saw that.
opportunity, and so it's kind of just like there's not necessarily a party desire to elevate to say that there's room for this, whereas they will say that there's room in our coalition for, frankly, homophobes, transphobic people, um, especially on the center right, who are otherwise anti-Trump, and that's what kind of I found frustrating when Nessel said, well, during my I was called a groomer and I was called a pedophile, and that's no different from what the anti-Semitic things that um, Congresswoman said, which is just demonstrably untrue, because that's like the difference between twisting an interpretation that I think is unfair because she didn't actually say that, to literally, you know, um, using smears that had led to attacks, like from libs of TikTok, groomer and pet. These are led to attacks on people, a whole kind of own sort of pink scare, as it were, and to equate that to uh, basically just saying, I think that you are not, that you are perhaps have a bias against Palestinian people. Um, Whether you
Yeah,
agree with that comment or not is nowhere to me in the same
Tlaib
ballpark.
didn't even say that. She said that the office.
Yeah,
She didn't accuse her in particular. She said that the office she felt had an anti-Palestinian bias. And again, I think that's true. As again demonstrated by the way that Tlaib herself has been treated. And it shouldn't be. It's the same thing as when you sort of say, you point out to somebody, oh, that comment was racist, or there's a bias against black people in criminal justice, right? I mean, that's not a smear, that's a statement with a lot of evidence behind it in terms of how justice works in this country, and it just should not be that controversial to argue that there's not the same but kind of similar or parallel prejudice against Palestinian people. Against, there's obviously, people know that there's Islamophobic bias and anti-Arab bias in the way the U.S. government treats those communities in terms of surveillance, in terms of criminal justice. Um, and yeah, if when you're prosecuting peaceful protesters for, demonstrating against war crimes, I think it's
mhm.
pretty reasonable to suggest that, the issue is bias, and that you don't, and that, you support this state and are, trying to silence criticism of it.
It feels like, as I said, it was like they're taking crazy pills, because a couple years ago, the argument was that the left, we were, tyrants and censoring free speech on college campuses, because we wouldn't allow someone to come in and say that trans women aren't women, and to come in and say that awful, you didn't we should have a freedom of ideas and expressions, and to see Republicans saying, oh, people aren't safe on campus because of what people are saying, when that was not an opinion. We could agree. We could say, like, okay, well, someone's safety should be considered. But Republicans weren't there just 2 years ago for many groups, including my own and including queer people. So it's what do you think kind of goes with the idea of like trying to take Republicans in good faith on this issue?
Oh, well, I mean, it's obvious they're in bad faith. I mean, Republicans don't care about free speech on college campuses, and they never cared about free speech. I talked to Jason Stanley last week, I think, at Public Notice. I interviewed him about his new book, Erasing History, which is about the way that the right historically and, sort of like cross nationally targets educational institutions, and especially history, but, just across, but education institutions in general, as because they see them sort of as centers of creating rival narratives, creating sort of as institutions that might contest fascist power, because they preserve memory of different groups and different narratives, because they sort of like push back against fascist myth making. So, I mean, it's all part of that. I mean, the right, to some extent, the right cares about Israel as part of its, push for sort of like ethno-nationalism, as part of its hatred of Muslims and Arab people, as part of its hatred of people of color. It sees Israel as kind of like epitomizing or advancing those causes, but also it's just like targeting campus protesters. And Jason Stanley talks about this. Targeting campus protesters and getting police on campus is a way to crush the left, which often opposes fascism. It's a way to infiltrate and gain control over educational institutions more largely, right? I mean, because they bullied college presidents into doing their bidding, right?
Yeah.
So if they can do that once, they can do that again. And why might they want to do that if they have a fascist regime in power? Well, there are lots of reasons, right? And it also, it kind of normalizes this idea that you're going to have police coming in and busting heads, which, and campuses are always like, sort of like a big center of protest, and they're where protests often start. They're an important source of resistance. So if you're planning to have like a fascist takeover of government and end elections, right, wouldn't it be a good idea to normalize this sense that you can send police into campuses and arrest students and demonize students and throw them in jail because, then they can't protest when you eliminate abortion rights nationwide, or eliminate the vote, or raise the voting age, or whatever, sort of like anti-democratic fascist policies you want to institute. And these campus protests have been a way for the right to sort of co-opt a lot of liberals who are sort of progressive on everything, but not Israel. Right? Israel is kind of like an entry point to get them to appreciate fascist politics.
Yeah.
In and that can create alliances. It can create precedents for greater repression. And I think it's again, it's really dangerous that kind of a lot of people who are you'd like to think were anti-fascist, like Jay Tapper, like Dana Bash, like these college heads, and really like many, like lots of just kind of commenters that you'd like to think that they'd be allies against fascism, but then they don't seem to realize the dangers that happen when you ally with fascists against
Oh
student
yeah.
protesters or against sitting Congress people. I think Tlaib's in real danger if Trump becomes president.
Oh yeah, and
And
folks
I
don't
don't,
recognize that.
people need to be practicing solidarity, because they're gonna come for her, and where are you gonna be?
Well, there's the perception of, and I remember seeing this a lot, and I can appreciate, but it was sort of, oh, I can't believe I'm sharing this video of Elise Stefanik going after, I can't believe, but she's on my side. It's like, I don't think to me, it was like, I would examine my position if it felt like, well, maybe this person's not, this person's evil. And this, in one case, and as I said, Israeli
Well,
prime minister is
people,
very Trump-like, and Trump's rhetoric and Trump's, what he talks about, and it's not obviously his made. Israel's under very real concerns and issues. Certainly, Trump though he demonizes his enemies, makes up an issue of our survival, our people's survival, because he considers white people, our people's survival depends on protecting ourselves against everyone who's invading us and doing this sort of stuff. And as you said, it's fascism, and sort of, he can get you to kind of go into that fascism once you kind of open that door. And this one other thought for you, it to me, it felt what was particularly, when we talk about weaponizing anti-Semitism, because in these circles, not that like being called a communist or even groomer or pedophile is not something you can shrug off, but within, if Stefanik had hauled in a college president and was like, "Oh, you are enabling communism. If you're enabling," it clearly then looks like McCarthy. She probably keeps her job, or even if she got pushed out, like she gets another. Like, it isn't a literal scarlet letter that it would, because it rightly should be. Anti-Semitism is horrible. And so when that's applied, you're kind of allowing, as you said, if Republicans want to, obliterate left leaning institutions, or just academic institutions in general, anything that's not right wing, less so that it's left, or anything that's not right wing, kind of allowing it to be smeared by things that even we find repulsive helps, right? Because then it's like, oh my God, you allowed anti-Semitics to run wild on campus. I don't want anything part of you, which is a legitimate instinct. So that, it seems very disturbing when that was going on, because it seems so clear what Stefanik and others were doing.
yeah. Well, that poem that people quote, first they came for this group, then they came for that group, and I did nothing. They it kind of often doesn't get translated quite right, but in the first group there is, first they came for the communists, right? And you can see, coming for the left is often somewhat popular. Even with people, even with liberals, even with people who are kind of not on the right. You can create a consensus to go after the left often, and that builds power to go after other people. And in this case, again, it's like especially bad because protesting war crimes is not bad; it's good even. And while it's true that there's, I thought Ta-Nehisi Coates, said, I can't remember exactly what he said, but he said something like, those people, the people protesting who are maybe using slogans I don't agree with, um, and who might say things I don't agree with, they still kind of have more of a moral grounding than the people who, the people in newsrooms with Pulitzer Prizes who are making excuses for this. So.
Mm-hmm. Um, and so, kind of, with the time we have left, this did seem, I'm not going to be conspiracy theories of being sort of like that it was deliberately packaged to diminish the Robinson story, but it does seem like it's part of an overall. There's a almost, I don't know if it's a drive or an impulse to, oh my God, it seems as if we're saying that Republicans are really bad and we can't do this, so we need to sort of make it look like it's something that our fairness depends on. We are going after both sides.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that it's like, it's like, is racism a conspiracy? I mean, sort of. I mean, like in some ways it is, right? I mean, but it doesn't necessarily need tons of centralized coordination,
Hmm.
right? You just kind of need some sort of like, I mean, as you said, there's this impulse, there's this both sides impulse. There is this, I mean, I think Tlaib is right. There's this prejudice against Palestinians, and you kind of put those things together and you kind of get a situation where it's easier to focus on, on whatever Tlaib happens to say or on criticism of Israel than to focus on, sort of even heinous anti-Semitism from somebody like Mark Robinson. So, yeah, I mean, I think that um, institutions like CNN are, they want to be able to both sides things. And I think there's also a big impulse to, because of prejudice against Palestinians, um, because there's a bipartisan, sort of like support for Israel's current horrific policies. And the world of CNN is a world that's pretty constrained by whatever the two major parties do, right? So there's a impulse to sort of like make criticism of Israel, you know, maybe not as bad as like saying you're a black Nazi, but close, right? Something like that. So yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of, Trump's history of anti-Semitism, or thinks of the typical tropes, like I don't want black people counting my money, only Jews, and that type of stuff. Um,
Right, Brett Stevens, who's Jewish, besides, I mean, sort of off to the side of being a fool. I mean, he told the Times, "Oh, I don't for a minute think Donald Trump is anti-Semitic." Like, what are you talking about? Of course, he's anti-Semitic. He's
well,
made
yeah,
anti-Semitic statements for years. Um,
yeah, and and again, just to keep it briefly, restore to your time, it does seem as if, because that's, the label of, and this label is very easy to apply to the congresswoman in ways that, and I've written about this and I got a lot of pushback. What do you mean that's not fair? It's like, no, no, no. Like, one, Obama it would have been very rare for him to say this politician, especially from his own party, but like, no, Joe Manchin is a racist. He only said this because he's a racist. He would never do this, or he would, this is not something black politicians do. And um even with Trump, to get to the point where mainstream media were to say he's racist, even when he's smearing, you know, all the women of color, progressive women of color, as going back where they came from. And at his hate rallies, it would be things like racially charged, or to treat it as a tactic, right? So it's just, oh, he's appealing to racists. He himself is not racist. Oh, we wish he wouldn't do that. But, in ways that there's no problem of saying Tlaib is racist, or, is anti-Semitic, hates Jews, like, and very specific terms of, like, I've seen hates Jews relating to her in ways that hates black people, no mainstream, or even, again, politicians would say. It was very, I've had it edited when I used to work at other publications to even suggest that Trump supporters were racist, or even, because Clinton got in trouble for that. It's like, so it was a very high bar for race. So I get why Stevens would say that, right? The idea of like, oh, he's not a Semitic. He's just like the guy on, he's Archie Bunker. He's kind of cuddly, right? And he sort of benefited from that, right? These sort of Archie Bunkerism of his racism. Oh, he's, he says this about black people, or he might say this about Jews, but he's not anti-Semitic. I mean, that you have to like be part of an organized, that's like, it's a specific thing. But we will say that this congresswoman is anti-Semitic. And I don't know, to enclose, if it is related to specifically more about this is a way for us to smear anyone advocating for Palestine or advocating for their Muslim heritage, as Ilhan Omar.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's yeah, I mean, I think it's because there's bias against Tlaib because she's Palestinian, but there's also just the sense that it's easier to sort of, it's more acceptable in a lot of ways to say somebody is anti-Semitic when they criticize Israel than when they, warn Jews that they better vote for them or else, like,
Thank you so much, Noah, for your
yeah, thank you for
commentary.
having me.
Folks, like, share, subscribe, and also check out Noah's Substack. Everything is horrible in his work across everywhere. So again, I'll be keeping links below, and we'll check you next time. Thank you.